Arsenal, squad for the 2025-26 season. Arsenal, from England, a Premier League giant with a young squad, playing at the Emirates Stadium, valued at €1.33 billion this season. David Raya, Spanish goalkeeper. 29 years old, valued at €40 million. Kepa Arrizabalaga, Spanish goalkeeper. 30 years old, valued at €10 million. William Saliba, French defender. 24 years old, valued at €80 million. Christian Mosquera, Spanish defender. 21 years old, valued at €30 million. Ben White, English defender. 27 years old, valued at €45 million. Piero Hincapié, Ecuadorian defender. 23 years old, valued at €50 million. Gabriel Magalhaes, Brazilian defender. 27 years old, valued at €75 million. Jurrien Timber, Dutch defender. 24 years old, valued at €55 million. Riccardo Calafiori, Italian defender. 23 years old, valued at €35 million. Miles Lewis Skelly, English defender. 18 years old, valued at €45 million. Martin Odegaard, Norwegian midfielder. 26 years old, valued at €85 million. Eberechi Ez, English midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €55 million. Christian Norgard, Danish midfielder. 31 years old, valued at €11 million. Ethan Nwaneri, English midfielder. 18 years old, valued at €55 million. Mikel Merino, Spanish midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €35 million. Martin Zubimendi, Spanish midfielder. 26 years old, valued at €60 million. Declan Rice, English midfielder. 26 years old, valued at €120 million. Max Dowman, English midfielder. 15 years old, valued at €30 million. Bukayo Saka, English forward. 23 years old, valued at €150 million. Gabriel Jesus, Brazilian forward. 28 years old, valued at €32 million. Gabriel Martinelli, Brazilian forward. 24 years old, valued at €55 million. Victor Gyökeres, Swedish forward. 27 years old, valued at €75 million. Leandro Trossard, Belgian forward. 30 years old, valued at €22 million. Noni Madueke, English forward. 23 years old, valued at €40 million. Kai Havertz, German forward. 26 years old, valued at €65 million. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria. Aston Villa, squad 2025-26. Aston Villa, from England. Competing in the Premier League, with an average age of 27, playing at Villa Park with a market value of €547 million. Emiliano Martinez, Argentinian goalkeeper. 33 years old, valued at €20 million. Marco Bizzo, Dutch goalkeeper. 34 years old, valued at €3 million. Mati Cash, Polish defender. 28 years old, valued at €25 million. Victor Lindelof, Swedish defender. 31 years old, valued at €8 million. Ezri Konsa, English defender. 27 years old, valued at €35 million. Tyrone Mings, English defender. 32 years old, valued at €5 million. Lucas Dean, French defender. 32 years old, valued at €10 million. Pau Torres, Spanish defender. 28 years old, valued at €32 million. Andres Garcia, Spanish defender. 22 years old, valued at €7 million. Ian Maatsen, Dutch defender. 23 years old, valued at €28 million. Lamer Bogaard, Dutch defender. 21 years old, valued at €6 million. Ross Barkley, English midfielder. 31 years old, valued at €60 million. John McGinn, Scottish midfielder. 30 years old, valued at €16 million. Yuri Tielemans, Belgian midfielder. 28 years old, valued at €38 million. Harvey Elliott, English midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €30 million. Emiliano Buendia, Argentinian midfielder. 28 years old, valued at €15 million. Amadou Onana, Belgian midfielder. 24 years old, valued at €50 million. Boubacar Kamara, French midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €40 million. Ollie Watkins, English forward. 29 years old, valued at €40 million. Doniel Malen, Dutch forward. 26 years old, valued at €25 million. Jadon Sancho, English forward. 25 years old, valued at €28 million. Morgan Rogers, English forward. 23 years old, valued at €55 million. Evan Gesund, Ivorian forward. 24 years old, valued at €25 million. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria. AFC Bournemouth, Squad 2025-26 season. Bournemouth, from England, competing in the Premier League, with an average age of 24, playing at Vitality Stadium with a market value of €389 million. The coach is Andoni Iraola. George Petrovic, Serbian goalkeeper. 25 years old, valued at €20 million. Will Dennis, English goalkeeper. 25 years old, valued at €500,000. Alex Jimenez, Spanish defender. 20 years old, valued at €15 million. Julian Arroyo, Mexican defender. 24 years old, valued at €10 million. Adrian Truffert, French defender. 23 years old, valued at €15 million. Marcos Senesi, Argentinian defender. 28 years old, valued at €22 million. Adam Smith, English defender. 34 years old, valued at €1 million. Bavode Diakite, French defender. 24 years old, valued at €28 million. Julio Sola, Argentinian defender. 20 years old, valued at €8 million. James Hill, English defender. 23 years old, valued at €3 million. Owen Bevan, Welsh defender. 21 years old, valued at €1 million. Veljko Milošević, Serbian defender. 18 years old, valued at €1 million. Matai Akinemboni, American defender. 18 years old, valued at €1 million. Lewis Cook, English midfielder. 28 years old, valued at €15 million. David Brooks, Welsh midfielder. 28 years old, valued at €10 million. Alex Scott, English midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €20 million. Ryan Christie, Scottish midfielder. 30 years old, valued at €10 million. Tyler Adams, American midfielder. 26 years old, valued at €18 million. Marcus Tavernier, English midfielder. 26 years old, valued at €18 million. Romain Fayavre, French midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €6 million. Evanilson, Brazilian forward. 25 years old, valued at €35 million. Ben Doak, Scottish forward. 19 years old, valued at €14 million. Amine Adli, Moroccan forward. 25 years old, valued at 18 million euros. Justin Kluivert, Dutch forward. 26 years old, valued at 35 million euros. Eli Kroupi, French forward. 19 years old, valued at 15 million euros. Antoine Semenyo, Ghanaian forward. 25 years old, valued at 40 million euros. Enes Unal, Turkish forward. 28 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Remy Rees-Dotten, English forward. 19 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria. Brentford FC, Squad 2025-26 season. Brentford, from England, competing in the Premier League, with an average age of 24, playing at the GTEC Community Stadium with a market value of €392 million. Coached by Keith Andrews. Kevin Callagher, Irish goalkeeper. 26 years old, valued at €20 million. Håkon Valdimarsson, Icelandic goalkeeper. 23 years old, valued at €2 million. Matthew Cox, English goalkeeper. 22 years old, valued at €1 million. Ellery Balcom, English goalkeeper. 25 years old, valued at €500,000. Aaron Hickey, Scottish defender. 23 years old, valued at €10 million. Rico Henry, English defender. 28 years old, valued at €15 million. Sepp van den Berg, Dutch defender. 23 years old, valued at €22 million. Ethan Pinnock, Jamaican defender. 32 years old, valued at €7 million. Christopher Ajer, Norwegian defender. 27 years old, valued at €18 million. Nathan Collins, Irish defender. 24 years old, valued at €28 million. Michael Kayode, Italian defender. 21 years old, valued at €18 million. Benjamin Arthur, English defender. 19 years old, valued at €1 million. Jordan Henderson, English midfielder. 35 years old, valued at €2 million. Kevin Schade, German midfielder. 23 years old, valued at €30 million. Matthias Jensen, Danish midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €14 million. Fabio Carvalho, Portuguese midfielder. 23 years old, valued at €14 million. Frank Onyeka, Nigerian midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €7 million. Anthony Malambo, Dutch midfielder. 20 years old, valued at €18 million. Yegor Yarmolyuk, Ukrainian midfielder. 21 years old, valued at €15 million. Mikkel Damsgaard, Danish midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €28 million. Miles Peart-Harris, Jamaican midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €1 million. Yunus Konak, Turkish midfielder. 19 years old, valued at €4 million. Vitaly Janelt, German midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €20 million. Paris Maghoma, English midfielder. 24 years old, valued at €1 million. Rommel Donovan, English midfielder. 18 years old, valued at €1 million. Igor Thiago, Brazilian forward. 24 years old, valued at €18 million. Reece Nelson, English forward. 25 years old, valued at €16 million. Dango Ouattara, Burkinabe forward. 23 years old, valued at €28 million. Keane Lewis Potter, English forward. 24 years old, valued at 23 million euros. Gustavo Nunes, Brazilian forward. 19 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more. Brighton, squad 2025-26 season. Brighton and Hove Albion, from England. Competing in the Premier League, with an average age of 26, playing at the Amex Stadium with a market value of 462 million euros. Coached by Fabian Hürzeler. Bart Verbruggen, Dutch goalkeeper. 23 years old, valued at 30 million euros. Jason Steele, English goalkeeper. 35 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Tom McGill, Canadian goalkeeper. 25 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Adam Webster, English defender. 30 years old, valued at 11 million euros. Lewis Dunk, English defender. 33 years old, valued at 6 million euros. Jan-Paul van Hecke, Dutch defender. 25 years old, valued at 32 million euros. Olivier Boscagli, French defender. 27 years old, valued at 20 million euros. Ferdi Kadiolu, Turkish defender. 25 years old, valued at 25 million euros. Maxime de Kuiper, Belgian defender. 24 years old, valued at 16 million euros. Joel Veltman, Dutch defender. 33 years old, valued at 4 million euros. Diego Coppola, Italian defender. 21 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Solly March, English midfielder. 31 years old, valued at 6 million euros. Brajan Gruda, German midfielder. 21 years old, valued at 25 million euros. Jack Hinchelwood, English midfielder. 20 years old, valued at 24 million euros. Carlos Balaba, Cameroonian midfielder. 21 years old, valued at 40 million euros. James Milner, English midfielder. 39 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Kaoru Mitoma, Japanese midfielder. 28 years old, valued at 40 million euros. Diego Gomez, Paraguayan midfielder. 22 years old, valued at 14 million euros. Yasin Ayari, Swedish midfielder. 21 years old, valued at 22 million euros. Mats Wiefer, Dutch midfielder. 25 years old, valued at 25 million euros. Stefanos Tsimas, Greek forward. 19 years old, valued at 22 million euros. Jorginho Rutter, French forward. 23 years old, valued at 32 million euros. Yankuba Minter, Gambian forward. 21 years old, valued at 30 million euros. Tom Watson, English forward. 19 years old, valued at 8 million euros. Danny Welbeck, English forward. 34 years old, valued at 5 million euros. Kostulis, Greek forward. 18 years old, valued at 12 million euros. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more football content. FC Burnley, squad 2025-26 season. Burnley, playing in the Premier League, with an average age of 26.3. Their stadium is Turf Moor. The squad has a total market value of 226 million euros. The coach is Scott Parker. Martin Dubravka, Slovak goalkeeper. 36 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Max Weiss, German goalkeeper. 21 years old, valued at 4 million euros. Václav Ladky, Czech goalkeeper. 34 years old, valued at 300,000 euros. Kyle Walker, English defender. 35 years old, valued at €4 million. Quillenshi Hartman, Dutch defender. 23 years old, valued at €14 million. Joe Worrell, English defender. 28 years old, valued at €5 million. Maxime Esteve, French defender. 23 years old, valued at €20 million. Axel Twanzebe, Congolese defender. 27 years old, valued at €5 million. Bashir Humphreys, English defender. 22 years old, valued at €7 million. Connor Roberts, Welsh defender. 29 years old, valued at €4 million. Hjalmar Ekdal, Swedish defender. 26 years old, valued at €5 million. Oliver Son, Peruvian defender. 24 years old, valued at €3 million. Lucas Perez, Brazilian defender. 24 years old, valued at €5 million. Jordan Bayer, German defender. 25 years old, valued at €6 million. Hannes Delcroix, Belgian defender. 26 years old, valued at €3 million. Leslie Ugachukwu, French midfielder. 21 years old, valued at €18 million. Florentino, Portuguese midfielder. 26 years old, valued at €22 million. Zian Fleming, Dutch midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €7 million. Josh Cullen, Irish midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €6 million. Hannibal, Tunisian midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €12 million. Josh Laurent, English midfielder. 30 years old, valued at €2 million. Jacob Brun Larsen, Danish forward. 26 years old, valued at €5 million. Lyle Foster, South African forward. 25 years old, valued at €6 million. Marcus Edwards, English forward. 26 years old, valued at €12 million. Jayden Anthony, English forward. 25 years old, valued at €9 million. Loum Tuna, French forward. 22 years old, valued at €10 million. Zeki Amdouni, Swiss forward. 24 years old, valued at €12 million. Armando Broja, Albanian forward. 24 years old, valued at €12 million. Mike Trezor, Belgian forward. 26 years old, valued at €5 million. Jadon Banel, Dutch forward. 20 years old, valued at €1 million. Ashley Barnes, English forward. 35 years old, valued at €1 million. Enik Agye, Belgian forward. 20 years old, valued at €1 million. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more football content. Chelsea FC, Squad 2025-26 season. Chelsea FC, from England. Competing in the Premier League, with an average age of 23, playing at Stamford Bridge with a market value of €1,080 million. Coached by Enzo Maresca. Robert Sanchez, Spanish goalkeeper. 27 years old, valued at €20 million. Philip Jorgensen, Danish goalkeeper. 23 years old, valued at €18 million. Gabriel Slonina, American goalkeeper. 21 years old, valued at €3 million. Axel Disasi, French defender. 27 years old, valued at €22 million. Marc Cucurella, Spanish defender. 27 years old, valued at €35 million. Tosin Adarabioyo, English defender. 27 years old, valued at 20 million euros. Benoit Badiashile, French defender. 24 years old, valued at 22 million euros. Levi Colwill, English defender. 22 years old, valued at 55 million euros. Jorel Hatto, Dutch defender. 19 years old, valued at 35 million euros. Trevoh Chalobah, English defender. 26 years old, valued at 25 million euros. Reece James, English defender. 25 years old, valued at 30 million euros. Malo Gusto, French defender. 22 years old, valued at 35 million euros. Wesley Fofana, French defender. 24 years old, valued at 25 million euros. Josh Akimpong, English defender. 19 years old, valued at 8 million euros. Mihailo Mudryk, Ukrainian midfielder. 24 years old, currently without market value due to suspension. Enzo Fernandez, Argentine midfielder. 24 years old, valued at 75 million euros. Cole Palmer, English midfielder. 23 years old, valued at 120 million euros. Dario Esugo, Portuguese midfielder. 20 years old, valued at 20 million euros. Andre Santos, Brazilian midfielder. 21 years old, valued at 35 million euros. Moises Caicedo, Ecuadorian midfielder. 23 years old, valued at 90 million euros. Facundo Buonanotte, Argentine midfielder. 20 years old, valued at 20 million euros. Romeo Lavia, Belgian midfielder. 21 years old, valued at 40 million euros. Pedro Neto, Portuguese forward. 25 years old, valued at 50 million euros. Liam Delap, English forward. 22 years old, valued at 40 million euros. Jamie Gittens, English forward. 21 years old, valued at 50 million euros. João Pedro, Brazilian forward. 23 years old, valued at 50 million euros. Tariq George, English forward. 19 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Marc Guiu, Spanish forward. 19 years old, valued at 8 million euros. Esteval, Brazilian forward. 18 years old, valued at 60 million euros. Alejandro Garnacho, Argentine forward. 21 years old, valued at 45 million euros. Raheem Sterling, English forward. 30 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more football content. Crystal Palace FC, Squad 2025-26 season. Crystal Palace, from England. Competing in the Premier League, with an average age of 25, playing at Selhurst Park with a market value of 426 million euros. Coached by Oliver Glasner. Dean Henderson, English goalkeeper. 28 years old, valued at 20 million euros. Remy Matthews, English goalkeeper. 31 years old, valued at €500,000. Walter Benitez, Argentine goalkeeper. 32 years old, valued at €7 million. Daniel Munoz, Colombian defender. 29 years old, valued at €25 million. Tyrick Mitchell, English defender. 26 years old, valued at €25 million. Maxence Lacroix, French defender. 25 years old, valued at €25 million. Marc Guéhi, English defender. 25 years old, valued at €45 million. Nathaniel Klein, English defender. 34 years old, valued at €1 million. JD Canvo, French defender. 19 years old, valued at €4 million. Borna Sosa, Croatian defender. 27 years old, valued at €4 million. Chris Richards, American defender. 25 years old, valued at €14 million. Chadi Riyad, Moroccan defender. 22 years old, valued at €15 million. Caleb Pora, English defender. 19 years old, valued at €1 million. Jefferson Lerma, Colombian midfielder. 30 years old, valued at €10 million. Yeremy Pino, Spanish midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €30 million. Kristantis Uche, Nigerian midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €15 million. Daichi Kamada, Japanese midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €12 million. Will Hughes, English midfielder. 30 years old, valued at €7 million. Adam Wharton, English midfielder. 21 years old, valued at €45 million. Romain Esse, English midfielder. 20 years old, valued at €12 million. Czech Doucouré, Malian midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €25 million. Nouerou Ahamada, French midfielder. 23 years old, valued at €3 million. Justin Devaney, Northern Irish midfielder. 21 years old, valued at €6 million. Ismaila Sarr, Senegalese forward. 27 years old, valued at €25 million. Eddie Nketiah, English forward. 26 years old, valued at €18 million. Jean-Philippe Matata, French forward. 28 years old, valued at €30 million. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more football content. Everton FC, Squad 2025-26 season. Everton FC, from England. Competing in the Premier League, with an average age of 26, playing at Hill Dickinson Stadium, with a market value of €368 million. Coached by David Moyes. Jordan Pickford, English goalkeeper. 31 years old, valued at €18 million. Mark Travers, Irish goalkeeper. 26 years old, valued at €4 million. Tom King, Welsh goalkeeper. 30 years old, valued at €200,000. Harry Tyra, English goalkeeper. 23 years old, valued at €400,000. Nathan Patterson, Scottish defender. 23 years old, valued at €15 million. Michael Keane, English defender. 32 years old, valued at €5 million. James Tarkowski, English defender. 32 years old, valued at €9 million. Jake O'Brien, Irish defender. 24 years old, valued at €18 million. Vitaly Mykolenko, Ukrainian defender. 26 years old, valued at €28 million. Seamus Coleman, Irish defender. 36 years old, valued at €1 million. Jared Branthwaite, English defender. 23 years old, valued at €50 million. Adam Asnou, Moroccan defender. 19 years old, valued at €4 million. Dewsbury Hall, English midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €20 million. Carlos Alcaraz, Argentine midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €14 million. Idrissa Gueye, Senegalese midfielder. 35 years old, valued at €2 million. Merlin Roll, German midfielder. 23 years old, valued at €12 million. James Garner, English midfielder. 24 years old, valued at €18 million. Tim Iroegbunam, English midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €9 million. Dwight McNeil, English forward. 25 years old, valued at €25 million. Asterisk, Beto, Guinea-Bissau forward. 27 years old, valued at €22 million. Iliman Ndiaye, Senegalese forward. 25 years old, valued at €22 million. Thierno Barry, French forward. 22 years old, valued at €20 million. Jack Grealish, English forward. 30 years old, valued at €28 million. Tyler Dibbling, English forward. 19 years old, valued at €25 million. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more football content. Fulham FC, Squad 2025-26 season. Fulham Football Club, from England. Competing in the Premier League, with an average squad age of 28 years. The team holds a market value of €337 million. Head coach, Marco Silva. Bernd Leno, German goalkeeper. 33 years old, valued at €10 million. Benjamin Lecomte, French goalkeeper. 34 years old, valued at €1 million. Kenny Tete, Dutch defender. 29 years old, valued at €13 million. Calvin Bassey, Nigerian defender. 25 years old, valued at €25 million. Joachim Andersen, Danish defender. 29 years old, valued at €27 million. Jorge Cuenca, Spanish defender. 25 years old, valued at €5 million. Timothy Castaigne, Belgian defender. 29 years old, valued at €13 million. Ryan Sessegnon, English defender. 25 years old, valued at €15 million. Issa Diop, French defender. 28 years old, valued at €14 million. Antoine Robinson, American defender. 28 years old, valued at €35 million. Harrison Reed, English midfielder. 30 years old, valued at €6 million. Tom Cairney, Scottish midfielder. 34 years old, valued at €2 million. Sander Berge, Norwegian midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €25 million. Sasa Lukic, Serbian midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €14 million. Josh King, English midfielder. 18 years old, valued at €1 million. Emile Smith-Rowe, English midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €30 million. Raúl Jiménez, Mexican forward. 34 years old, valued at €5 million. Harry Wilson, Welsh forward. 28 years old, valued at €15 million. Rodrigo Muniz, Brazilian forward. 24 years old, valued at €20 million. Adama Traoré, Spanish forward. 29 years old, valued at €9 million. Alex Iwobi, Nigerian forward. 29 years old, valued at €28 million. Jonah Kusi Asare, Swedish forward. 18 years old, valued at €2 million. Samuel Chukwueze, Nigerian forward. 26 years old, valued at €10 million. Kevin, Brazilian forward. 22 years old, valued at €12 million. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more football updates. Leeds United FC, Squad 2025-26 season. Leeds United FC, from England. Competing in the Premier League, with an average age of 27, playing at Elland Road with a market value of €296 million. Coached by Daniel Farke. Lucas Perry, Brazilian goalkeeper. 27 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Ilan Meslier, French goalkeeper. 25 years old, valued at 16 million euros. Alex Cairns, English goalkeeper. 32 years old, valued at 100,000 euros. Carl Darlow, Welsh goalkeeper. 34 years old, valued at 200,000 euros. Jayden Bogle, English defender. 25 years old, valued at 9 million euros. Gabriel Gudmundsson, Swedish defender. 26 years old, valued at 7 million euros. Ethan Ampadu, Welsh defender. 25 years old, valued at 20 million euros. Pascal Strijk, Dutch defender. 26 years old, valued at 18 million euros. Joe Rodden, Welsh defender. 27 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Jaka Bijol, Slovenian defender. 26 years old, valued at 18 million euros. Sebastian Bornau, Belgian defender. 26 years old, valued at 6 million euros. James Justin, English defender. 27 years old, valued at 13 million euros. Sam Byram, English defender. 32 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Daniel James, Welsh midfielder. 27 years old, valued at 18 million euros. Sean Longstaff, English midfielder. 27 years old, valued at 20 million euros. Brendan Aronson, American midfielder. 24 years old, valued at 15 million euros. Anton Stack, German midfielder. 26 years old, valued at 14 million euros. Ao Tanaka, Japanese midfielder. 27 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Sam Chambers, Scottish midfielder. 18 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Ilya Gruev, Bulgarian midfielder. 25 years old, valued at 6 million euros. Calvert-Lewin, English forward. 28 years old, valued at 16 million euros. Joel Pirro, Dutch forward. 26 years old, valued at 18 million euros. Lucas Inmeka, German forward. 26 years old, valued at 3 million euros. Noah Okafor, Swiss forward. 25 years old, valued at 13 million euros. Jack Harrison, English forward. 28 years old, valued at 14 million euros. Wilfried Gnonto, Italian forward. 21 years old, valued at 22 million euros. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more football content and squad updates. Liverpool FC, Squad 2025-26 season. Liverpool FC, from England. Competing in the Premier League, with an average age of 25.5. Playing at Anfield, the squad's total market value is €1.12 billion. The coach is Arne Slot. Alisson, Brazilian goalkeeper, 32 years old, valued at €20 million. Mamardashvili, Georgian goalkeeper, 24 years old, valued at €30 million. Freddie Woodman, English goalkeeper, 28 years old, valued at €3 million. Orman Peksi, Hungarian goalkeeper, 20 years old, valued at €1 million. Joe Gomez, English defender, 28 years old, valued at €20 million. Virgil van Dijk, Dutch defender, 34 years old, valued at €23 million. Ibrahima Konate, French defender, 26 years old, valued at €60 million. Milos Kerke, Hungarian defender, 21 years old, valued at €45 million. Conor Bradley, Northern Irish defender, 22 years old, valued at 30 million euros. Giovanni Leone, Italian defender. 18 years old, valued at 18 million euros. Andrew Robertson, Scottish defender. 31 years old, valued at 18 million euros. Jeremy Frimpong, Dutch defender. 24 years old, valued at 50 million euros. Wataru Endo, Japanese midfielder. 32 years old, valued at 8 million euros. Florian Wirtz, German midfielder. 22 years old, valued at 140 million euros. Dominik Szoboszlai, Hungarian midfielder. 24 years old, valued at 80 million euros. Alexis Mac Allister, Argentine midfielder. 26 years old, valued at 100 million euros. Curtis Jones, English midfielder. 24 years old, valued at 45 million euros. Ryan Gravenberch, Dutch midfielder. 23 years old, valued at 75 million euros. Trey Nyoni, English midfielder. 18 years old, valued at 5 million euros. Alexander Isak, Swedish forward. 26 years old, valued at 120 million euros. Mohamed Salah, Egyptian forward. 33 years old, valued at 50 million euros. Federico Chiesa, Italian forward. 27 years old, valued at 14 million euros. Cody Gakpo, Dutch forward. 26 years old, valued at 70 million euros. Hugo Ekitike, French forward. 23 years old, valued at 75 million euros. Rio Ngumoha, English forward. 17 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more football updates and player insights. Manchester City, Squad 2025-26 season. Manchester City FC, from England. Competing in the Premier League, with an average age of 26, playing at the Etihad Stadium with a market value of €1,230 million. Coached by Pep Guardiola. James Trafford, English goalkeeper. 22 years old, valued at €22 million. Marcus Bettinelli, English goalkeeper. 33 years old, valued at €1 million. Stefan Ortega, German goalkeeper. 32 years old, valued at €8 million. Gianluigi Donnarumma, Italian goalkeeper. 26 years old, valued at €40 million. Ruben Dias, Portuguese defender. 28 years old, valued at €65 million. John Stones, English defender. 31 years old, valued at €25 million. Nathan Ake, Dutch defender. 30 years old, valued at €25 million. Ryan Ait-Nouri, Algerian defender. 24 years old, valued at €35 million. Josko Gvardiol, Croatian defender. 23 years old, valued at €75 million. Abdukadir Kusanov, Uzbek defender. 21 years old, valued at €35 million. Rico Lewis, English defender. 20 years old, valued at €40 million. Tijani Reinders, Dutch midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €60 million. Mateo Kovacic, Croatian midfielder. 31 years old, valued at €20 million. Ryan Cherki, French midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €45 million. Nico Gonzalez, Spanish midfielder. 23 years old, valued at €40 million. Rodri, Spanish midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €110 million. Bernardo Silva, Portuguese midfielder. 31 years old, valued at €38 million. Mateus Nunes, Portuguese midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €35 million. Nico O'Reilly, English midfielder. 20 years old, valued at €18 million. Calvin Phillips, English midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €12 million. Phil Foden, English midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €100 million. Oscar Bob, Norwegian midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €25 million. Omar Marmoush, Egyptian forward. 26 years old, valued at €75 million. Erling Haaland, Norwegian forward. 25 years old, valued at €180 million. Jeremy Doku, Belgian forward. 23 years old, valued at €50 million. Savinho, Brazilian forward. 21 years old, valued at €50 million. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more football content. Manchester United squad 2025-26 season. Manchester United Football Club, from England. Competing in the Premier League, with an average age of 25, playing at Old Trafford with a market value of €723 million. Coached by Ruben Amorim. Altay Bayındır, Turkish goalkeeper. 27 years old, valued at €8 million. Tom Heaton, English goalkeeper. 39 years old, valued at €200,000. Sen Lammens, Belgian goalkeeper. 23 years old, valued at €9 million. Diogo Dalot, Portuguese defender. 26 years old, valued at €30 million. Noussair Mazraoui, Moroccan defender. 27 years old, valued at €25 million. Matthijs de Ligt, Dutch defender. 26 years old, valued at €38 million. Harry Maguire, English defender. 32 years old, valued at €13 million. Lisandro Martinez, Argentine defender. 27 years old, valued at €40 million. Terrell Malaysia, Dutch defender. 26 years old, valued at €8 million. Patrick Dorgu, Danish defender. 20 years old, valued at €25 million. Lenny Yoro, French defender. 19 years old, valued at €55 million. Luke Shaw, English defender. 30 years old, valued at €12 million. Aidan Heaven, English defender. 19 years old, valued at €5 million. Tyler Fredrickson, English defender. 20 years old, valued at €3 million. Diego Leon, Paraguayan defender. 18 years old, valued at €4 million. Mason Mount, English midfielder. 26 years old, valued at €28 million. Bruno Fernandes, Portuguese midfielder. 31 years old, valued at €50 million. Casemiro, Brazilian midfielder. 33 years old, valued at €10 million. Manuel Ugarte, Uruguayan midfielder. 24 years old, valued at €45 million. Kobbie Mainoo, English midfielder. 20 years old, valued at €50 million. Mateus Cunha, Brazilian forward. 26 years old, valued at €60 million. Joshua Zirkzee, Dutch forward. 24 years old, valued at €30 million. Amad Diallo, Ivorian forward. 23 years old, valued at €45 million. Brian Mbeumo, Cameroonian forward. 26 years old, valued at €55 million. Benjamin Sesko, Slovenian forward. 22 years old, valued at €70 million. Chido Obi, Danish forward. 17 years old, valued at €5 million. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more football content. Newcastle United, Squad 2025-26 season. Newcastle United FC, from England. Competing in the Premier League. They play at St James Park. The total market value of the team is €659 million. The manager is Eddie Howe. Nick Pope, English goalkeeper. 33 years old, valued at €8 million. John Ruddy, English goalkeeper. 38 years old, valued at €100,000. Mark Gillespie, English goalkeeper. 33 years old, valued at €200,000. Aaron Ramsdale, English goalkeeper. 27 years old, valued at €16 million. Kieran Trippier, English defender. 35 years old, valued at €4 million. Lewis Hall, English defender. 21 years old, valued at €32 million. Sven Botman, Dutch defender. 25 years old, valued at €42 million. Fabian Schär, Swiss defender. 33 years old, valued at €7 million. Jamal Lascelles, English defender. 31 years old, valued at €4 million. Malik Thiaw, German defender. 24 years old, valued at €18 million. Emil Krafth, Swedish defender. 31 years old, valued at €2 million. Tino Livramento, English defender. 22 years old, valued at €40 million. Harrison Ashby, Scottish defender. 23 years old, valued at €2 million. Dan Burn, English defender. 33 years old, valued at €6 million. Alex Murphy, Irish defender. 21 years old, valued at €300,000. Joelinton, Brazilian midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €35 million. Sandro Tonali, Italian midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €60 million. Harvey Barnes, English midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €35 million. Jacob Murphy, English midfielder. 30 years old, valued at €16 million. Joe Willock, English midfielder. 26 years old, valued at €22 million. Bruno Guimaraes, Brazilian midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €80 million. Jacob Ramsey, English midfielder. 24 years old, valued at €32 million. Lewis Miley, English midfielder. 19 years old, valued at €22 million. Yoan Wissa, DR Congo forward. 29 years old, valued at €32 million. Anthony Gordon, English forward. 24 years old, valued at €65 million. William Osula, Danish forward. 22 years old, valued at €7 million. Anthony Elanga, Swedish forward. 23 years old, valued at €42 million. Nick Woltermaid, German forward. 23 years old, valued at €30 million. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more football content. Sunderland AFC, Squad 2025-26 season. Sunderland AFC, from England. Competing in the Premier League. They play at Stadium of Light. The total market value of the team is €290 million. The manager is Régis Lebris. Anthony Patterson, English goalkeeper. 25 years old, valued at €14 million. Blondie Nene Nikeu, Cameroonian goalkeeper. 24 years old, valued at €100,000. Simon Moore, English goalkeeper. 35 years old, valued at €100,000. Robin Roefs, Dutch goalkeeper. 22 years old, valued at €4 million. Timothy Pembele, French defender. 23 years old, valued at €3 million. Dennis Serkin, English defender. 23 years old, valued at €8 million. Dan Ballard, Northern Irish defender. 26 years old, valued at €8 million. Lutschale Geertruida, Dutch defender. 25 years old, valued at €20 million. Luke Oneen, English defender. 30 years old, valued at €1 million. Omar Alderete, Paraguayan defender. 28 years old, valued at €8 million. Rionildo Mandava, Mozambican defender. 31 years old, valued at €5 million. Nordi Mukil, French defender. 27 years old, valued at €10 million. Arthur Masuaku, Congolese defender. 31 years old, valued at €3 million. Try Hume, Northern Irish defender. 23 years old, valued at €12 million. Leo Held, Norwegian defender. 22 years old, valued at €2 million. Zach Johnson, English defender. 20 years old, valued at €1 million. Argie Elise, English defender. 24 years old, valued at €1 million. Joe Anderson, English defender. 24 years old, valued at €0.1 million. Jay Matete, English midfielder. 24 years old, valued at €0.4 million. Abdullah Bar, French midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €2 million. Dan Neal, English midfielder. 23 years old, valued at €7 million. Chris Rigg, English midfielder. 18 years old, valued at €20 million. Habib Diarra, Senegalese midfielder. 21 years old, valued at €20 million. Noah Siddiqui, Congolese midfielder. 20 years old, valued at €12 million. Enzo Lefebvre, French midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €18 million. Granit Xhaka, Swiss midfielder. 33 years old, valued at €12 million. Harrison Jones, English midfielder. 20 years old, valued at €200,000. Chemsdine Talbi, Moroccan forward. 20 years old, valued at €8 million. Brian Brobby, Dutch forward. 23 years old, valued at €22 million. Eliezer Mayenda, Spanish forward. 20 years old, valued at €12 million. Romain Mundel, English forward. 22 years old, valued at €6 million. Wilson Isidore, French forward. 25 years old, valued at €12 million. Simon Adingra, Ivorian forward. 23 years old, valued at €28 million. Bertrand Traoré, Burkinabe forward. 30 years old, valued at €8 million. Ahmed Abdullahi, Nigerian forward. 21 years old, valued at €1 million. Ian Poveda, Colombian forward. 25 years old, valued at €1 million. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more football content. Nottingham Forest, Squad 2025-26 season. Nottingham Forest Football Club, from England. Competing in the Premier League. They play at the City Ground. The total market value of the team is €566 million. The manager is Ange Postecoglou. John Victor, Brazilian goalkeeper. 29 years old, valued at €8 million. Angus Gunn, Scottish goalkeeper. 29 years old, valued at €2 million. Mats Sells, Belgian goalkeeper. 33 years old, valued at €7 million. Neco Williams, Welsh defender. 24 years old, valued at €20 million. Morato, Brazilian defender. 24 years old, valued at €14 million. Murillo, Brazilian defender. 23 years old, valued at €55 million. Jair Cunha, Brazilian defender. 20 years old, valued at €13 million. Willy Boley, Ivorian defender. 34 years old, valued at €2 million. Nikola Milenkovic, Serbian defender. 27 years old, valued at €35 million. Ola Aina, Nigerian defender. 28 years old, valued at €22 million. Oleksandr Zinchenko, Ukrainian defender. 28 years old, valued at €20 million. Niccolò Savona, Italian defender. 22 years old, valued at €12 million. Zach Abbott, English defender. 19 years old, valued at €1 million. Ibrahim Sangare, Ivorian midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €24 million. Elliot Anderson, English midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €32 million. Morgan Gibbs White, English midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €50 million. Douglas Luiz, Brazilian midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €30 million. Nicolas Dominguez, Argentine midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €18 million. Ryan Yates, English midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €12 million. James McCarthy, English midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €20 million. Hudson Odoi, English forward. 24 years old, valued at €25 million. Taiwo Awoniyi, Nigerian forward. 28 years old, valued at €16 million. Chris Wood, New Zealand forward. 33 years old, valued at €10 million. Dan Endoy, Swiss forward. 24 years old, valued at €35 million. Arnaud Calamuendo, French forward. 23 years old, valued at €35 million. Igor Jesus, Brazilian forward. 24 years old, valued at €15 million. Omari Hutchinson, English forward. 21 years old, valued at €22 million. Dylan Bakwa, French forward. 23 years old, valued at €25 million. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more football content. Tottenham Hotspur, Squad 2025-26 season. Tottenham Hotspur, from England. Competing in the Premier League. They play at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. The total market value of the team is €891 million. The manager is Thomas Frank. Guglielmo Vicario, Italian goalkeeper. 28 years old, valued at €32 million. Antonín Kinský, Czech goalkeeper. 22 years old, valued at €15 million. Brandon Austin, English goalkeeper. 26 years old, valued at €1 million. Radu Dragutin, Romanian defender. 23 years old, valued at €25 million. Kevin Danso, Austrian defender. 27 years old, valued at €25 million. Destiny Udogie, Italian defender. 22 years old, valued at €40 million. Christian Romero, Argentine defender. 27 years old, valued at 50 million euros. Pedro Porro, Spanish defender. 26 years old, valued at 38 million euros. DJ Spence, English defender. 25 years old, valued at 20 million euros. Kota Takai, Japanese defender. 21 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Ben Davies, Welsh defender. 32 years old, valued at 6 million euros. Mickey van der Ven, Dutch defender. 24 years old, valued at 50 million euros. João Palhinha, Portuguese midfielder. 30 years old, valued at 30 million euros. Xavi Simons, Dutch midfielder. 22 years old, valued at 70 million euros. Yves Bissouma, Malian midfielder. 29 years old, valued at 25 million euros. James Maddison, English midfielder. 28 years old, valued at 42 million euros. Archie Gray, English midfielder. 19 years old, valued at 38 million euros. Lucas Bergvall, Swedish midfielder. 19 years old, valued at 38 million euros. Mohamed Kudus, Ghanaian midfielder. 25 years old, valued at 45 million euros. Dejan Kulusevski, Swedish midfielder. 25 years old, valued at 50 million euros. Pape Matar Sarr, Senegalese midfielder. 23 years old, valued at 32 million euros. Rodrigo Bentancur, Uruguayan midfielder. 28 years old, valued at 30 million euros. Richarlison, Brazilian forward. 28 years old, valued at 20 million euros. Mathys Telephone, French forward. 20 years old, valued at 35 million euros. Dominic Solanke, English forward. 28 years old, valued at 40 million euros. Brennan Johnson, Welsh forward. 24 years old, valued at 40 million euros. Wilson Adobert, French forward. 20 years old, valued at 20 million euros. Randall Kolo Muani, French forward. 26 years old, valued at 30 million euros. Thanks for watching. Follow Football World Euphoria for more. West Ham United, Squad 2025-26 season. West Ham United, from England. Competing in the Premier League. They play at London Stadium. The total market value of the team is €371 million. The manager is Nuno Espirito Santo. Mads Hermansson, Danish goalkeeper. 25 years old, valued at €15 million. Łukasz Fabianski, Polish goalkeeper. 40 years old, valued at €1 million. Alphonse Areola, French goalkeeper. 32 years old, valued at €9 million. Kyle Walker-Peters, English defender. 28 years old, valued at €15 million. Maximilian Kilman, English defender. 28 years old, valued at €25 million. Igor Julio, Brazilian defender. 27 years old, valued at €20 million. Mavropanos, Greek defender. 27 years old, valued at €17 million. Jean-Claire Todibo, French defender. 25 years old, valued at €25 million. Aaron Wan-Bissaka, Congolese defender. 27 years old, valued at €24 million. Oliver Scarles, English defender. 19 years old, valued at €8 million. James Ward-Prowse, English midfielder. 30 years old, valued at €8 million. Lucas Paquetá, Brazilian midfielder. 28 years old, valued at €28 million. El Hadji Diouf, Senegalese midfielder. 20 years old, valued at 18 million euros. Matias Fernandes, Portuguese midfielder, 21 years old, valued at 15 million euros. Guido Rodriguez, Argentine midfielder, 31 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Magassa, French midfielder, 21 years old, valued at 12 million euros. Tomáš Souček, Czech midfielder, 30 years old, valued at 18 million euros. Freddie Potts, English midfielder, 22 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Andrew Irving, Scottish midfielder, 25 years old, valued at 4 million euros. George Earthy, English midfielder, 21 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Crescencio Somerville, Dutch forward, 23 years old, valued at 22 million euros. Callum Wilson, English forward, 33 years old, valued at 8 million euros. Niklas Füllkrug, German forward, 32 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Luis Guilherme, Brazilian forward, 19 years old, valued at 15 million euros. Jared Bowen, English forward, 28 years old, valued at 40 million euros. Callum Marshall, Northern Irish forward, 20 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Football World Euphoria. Wolverhampton Wanderers, Squad 2025-26 season. Wolverhampton Wanderers, from England, competing in the Premier League. They play at Molineux Stadium. The total market value of the team is 327 million euros. The manager is Vitor Pereira. José Sá, Portuguese goalkeeper, 32 years old, valued at 7 million euros. Daniel Bentley, English goalkeeper, 32 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Sam Johnston, English goalkeeper, 32 years old, valued at 6 million euros. Matt Doherty, Irish defender, 33 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Hugo Bueno, Spanish defender, 23 years old, valued at 8 million euros. Santiago Bueno, Uruguayan defender, 26 years old, valued at 10 million euros. David Moller-Wolf, Norwegian defender, 23 years old, valued at 9 million euros. Emmanuel Agbadou, Ivorian defender, 28 years old, valued at 20 million euros. Yerson Mosquera, Colombian defender, 24 years old, valued at 8 million euros. Ladislav Krejci, Czech defender, 26 years old, valued at 12 million euros. Rodrigo Gomes, Portuguese defender, 22 years old, valued at 15 million euros. Totti, Portuguese defender, 26 years old, valued at 28 million euros. Ki-Jana Hoever, Dutch defender, 23 years old, valued at 5 million euros. Jackson Charchua, Cameroonian defender, 24 years old, valued at 8 million euros. Marshall Munetsi, Zimbabwean midfielder, 29 years old, valued at 15 million euros. Andre, Brazilian midfielder, 24 years old, valued at 28 million euros. João Gomes, Brazilian midfielder, 24 years old, valued at 40 million euros. John Arias, Colombian midfielder, 28 years old, valued at 17 million euros. Jean Bellegarde, Haitian midfielder, 27 years old, valued at 18 million euros. Strand Larsen, Norwegian forward, 25 years old, valued at 30 million euros. Hee Chan Hwang, South Korean forward, 29 years old, valued at €12 million. Tolu Arakodare, Nigerian forward. 24 years old, valued at €18 million. Tawanda Chirewa, Zimbabwean forward. 21 years old, valued at €1 million. Ver Lopez, Spanish forward. 21 years old, valued at €5 million. Enzo Gonzalez, Paraguayan forward. 20 years old, valued at €4 million. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Football World Euphoria.